Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Epi Show, brought to you by the Jon Snow Radio Network. I'm your DJ, Dr. Bales. Now, sit back, relax, grab a LaCroix, pet a cat if you need to, and let's dive in. Last time we talked about measuring morbidity using incidence or prevalence. Today we're going to add a few new tools to the old Epi toolbox. So let's jump in. Measuring mortality, which is a fairly obvious endpoint, can be done in a number of different ways. The main three that we're going to focus on today are these: mortality rate, case fatality, and proportionate mortality. And just like with the incidence and prevalence rates we saw last time, they can tell us different things about the disease. Mortality rate is a main tool that we use to describe changes in mortality risk, and it is very similar to the incidence rate. Look at the calculation, and you see in the numerator the number of deaths occurring during a given period of time divided by the size of the population. The only difference between this and the incidence rate is we're looking at number of deaths rather than the number of cases. In its most simple form, sometimes called the crude mortality rate, when we're not really looking at anything in particular, we're not kind of trying to assess specific diseases in specific groups. If we just wanted to know the total number of deaths divided by the size of the population, it's this. If we wanted to get a little more specific with it, for example, looking at mortality rates for a specific cause, we would use this example. What is the annual mortality rate from pancreatic cancer? Well, since we're only interested in understanding the mortality rate for pancreatic cancer, we're not going to include all deaths. We're just going to include the number of deaths from pancreatic cancer in the numerator. And we'll still include the size of the population as our denominator. Now you can mix and match however you want, add whichever kind of indicators or filters you want to put on this equation. In this case, we're looking at the annual mortality rate among people over 65. And again, we are just going to add the number of deaths from people over 65. And remember, the population size in the denominator is those who are at risk of becoming a numerator. So to be included down here, you need to be theoretically at risk of becoming part of the numerator. So if you are 13 years old in the year that this calculation is made, well, you're never going to become a death over 65. You'll be included as a death in under 18, perhaps, but just remember, the size of the population of the denominator needs to follow this simple rule. To be considered as part of the denominator, you need to be at risk of becoming part of the numerator. So this is useful for starting to understand patterns and trying to tell a story, what's going on in our population. Now, we talked about the importance of controlling for population size differences. This is a figure of mortality rate from infectious diseases in the United States over the past 100 plus years. If we did not control for differences in the size of population, we would be telling a very different story here. Now, if you look at each year from 1900 up until the 2000s, the size of the population in the United States has changed quite a bit. It's gotten a lot larger. So, to make a fair comparison between years or across years, we need to control for that by including population in our calculation. So, mortality rate per 100,000 people is what we want to see. Now, this is just simply that taking that calculation, which is number of deaths divided by the size of the population each year, and just graphing it. So we see the story that's being told, or the pattern or trend, is that risk of death from infectious diseases is steadily going down in the United States over the past 100 plus years. The notable exception, that big old influenza pandemic that happened in 1918, you can see what an impact that had on the overall trend in mortality rate. You can also use this tool to understand geographic differences. So let's look at this figure, which maps the mortality rate per county for HIV/AIDS in the United States. So let's take it back to 1980. Well, HIV is flying under the radar at this point. That's why you don't see anything on the map. So let's slowly start to zoom forward in time. You can see where the first deaths start to kind of creep up. You can see in the West Coast, down in Florida, up in the East Coast. But it's still, fairly low across the entire country. But look what happens when we get into the 1990s. The risk of deaths from HIV starts to peak in the US. And it's quite widespread across many parts of the country, suggesting that this disease has found its way in all corners of the country, and the risk of death is higher in some places compared to others. And just like with that figure that we played around with last class, looking at incidence and prevalence to describe HIV, we know that some pretty big changes happened in the mid-1990s. Good medicines developed, good public health interventions utilized, and we see that mortality rate starts to steadily decrease. However, it still remains relatively high in some parts of the country. So this is a useful tool for understanding not only changes in HIV across the whole country, but also helping us understand kind of where risk remains high and where we might want to devote some resources towards reducing that. So our second indicator, case fatality. Case fatality tells us about the severity of a particular disease. So the equation for this is the number of deaths from a given disease divided by the number of people diagnosed with that disease. We can use this to compare, for example, COVID-19 by country. We see here the number of cases, the number of deaths, and this calculation is simply number of deaths divided by number of cases. It gives us our case fatality rate. So this lets us kind of understand the severity or the toll that it's taking on human life across different countries. We can also use it to compare the severity of different diseases. So Ebola is kind of a dreaded disease because of how severe it is. Outbreaks of Ebola from 2013 to 2016 have had a case fatality rate of about 40%, which is quite high. That 1918 flu pandemic, it's estimated to have a case fatality rate of around 10, meaning for every 10 people who contracted that disease, 1 died. Very high still. SARS, which was a coronavirus outbreak or pandemic, was also right around 10. And we see the current coronavirus pandemic estimates ranging from 3 to 4, that's still being that story is still being told, but recent estimates put it around 3.4. So let's look at this hypothetical example and see how, with just a little bit of information, we can calculate these two metrics. So let's look at Hartford County, which has a estimated population of 2,000 people, and we're interested in looking at the year 2016. So we know from the health department that 30 people were diagnosed with Lyme disease in 2016. And we know that 2 of these people died from the disease. So the mortality rate is the number of deaths divided by the size of the population, in this case, 20,000. That gives us a mortality rate. If we wanted to turn this into a kind of nicer, rounder number, we can multiply it by 100,000. And here is kind of our nice, easier to interpret mortality rate, 10 per 100,000. Case fatality, we're looking at the number of deaths. And in this case, our denominator is the number of cases of disease. Not everybody, but just who contracted this disease. Do the math and we get 6.7. That tells us about the severity of this disease in Hartford County. So 2 different metrics telling us 2 slightly different things about this disease, both useful in their own way. We can look at more examples of how this is utilized. This is COVID-19. Click on the link to explore this data set. Real quickly, I'll show you how both of these metrics can be used to help us understand the epidemiology of COVID-19 right now. So we can map the case fatality ratio. We can do mortality rate, and we can compare countries. So the mortality rate right now is highest in Brazil, then Argentina, Mexico, the UK, and the United States has quite a high mortality rate. So this tells us something about, the risk of death from this disease. It tells us about differences in disease severity. So if we look at case fatality ratio, 7.7% in Mexico. Let's see, compared to the US, which is around 1.6%. So you can see pretty big changes in the severity of COVID-19 between these countries. And this could be due to a number of different things. The different makeup of the population. So is one group older than another? Does one group have a higher rate of obesity? Are there differences in access to healthcare? So are people being kind of treated for the disease differently? All that kind of can be inferred from these kinds of calculations. And so if you look at the number of confirmed cases and the number of deaths by country, you can see how these calculations are made. So in Peru, for example, 2.1, give or take, million people have been diagnosed with COVID-19. 198,000 have died. If we wanted to know our case fatality rate, it's just deaths divided by cases. And if we wanted to know about the mortality rate, number of deaths divided by the population of Peru. Now, these population numbers I'll go into in a little more detail soon, but these can be gathered from such resources as the World Health Organization, which will report population estimates. So different countries have their own kind of census programs. The United States has ours, designed to estimate the size of the population. So these 2 numbers tell us important information and allow us to make comparisons across countries because we've taken into account size differences, and a useful tool. Okay, our third metric, proportionate mortality. Proportionate mortality defined as the total number of deaths from a given disease divided by the total number of deaths overall. So I think of this as usually in terms of a pie diagram. So in Canada, for example, in 2016, what was going on in terms of causes of death? We can see that the proportionate mortality for cancer, highest for all other diseases. Then we have other, not sure how that's defined, heart disease, and we can see the little slivers that make up the other causes of death. So cancer and heart disease make up a really big chunk of all the deaths in Canada. And then you see some of the contributors to mortality down here. So this gives us an understanding of kind of what's going on in a particular community. What types of diseases are impacting that community more than others? Again, this allows us to make comparisons over time, comparisons across countries. In this case, we're looking at basically deaths, causes of deaths. Now we're in Massachusetts. If we look at the beginning of this figure, we can see that the proportion of deaths due to infectious diseases is way higher than injuries, cancer, or heart disease. So we wind the clock back 100 plus years. The pie diagram, most of it will be taken up by infectious diseases. Fast forward to the 2000s, and that pie diagram looks quite a bit different. Now heart disease and cancer make up the largest slices, and infectious diseases and injuries down there. So here's another example that the World Health Organization has put together. A really nice, sleek dashboard for looking at different countries and specifically how they use mortality rates and mortality, proportionate mortality, and the different indicators we've just learned. You click on the link, it will take you to different country profiles. So let's look at the United States. So this is data for 2017. And we can see differences in death by gender over years due to different causes. We have death rates, kind of a single overall kind of picture. And this is really useful because we can understand not only what's going on in the United States, but we can compare with other countries, and we can look at differences over time. So if we go back to, let's say, 1995, we see some slight differences. Another interesting tool, again, using the indicators of mortality to ultimately, this is what we care about. We care about the story that is unfolding. What is the pattern? What is going on in this particular area? Those tools that we're learning in your Epi Toolbox help us get to this place. But now we can look at this and as epidemiologists say, okay, what's going on here? Why is that happening? And let's design some studies to try to figure out why these patterns are the way they are. So those are measures of mortality, and we're going to end on kind of a hybrid metric. That's why it gets its own little color down here at the bottom. The disability adjusted life year is a relatively new kid on the block, aka the DALY, disability adjusted life year. Now, this is not a measure of morbidity or mortality, it's a measure of morbidity and mortality. So, this in one metric combines information on morbidity and mortality to give us an idea of the burden of disease in particular populations. So let's dive into the calculation of the formula in a little more detail. To compute this metric, we're going to take the number of years that someone has lived with a disability or a disease with the number of years lost to that disease. Now let's go through an example. So one DALY means one lost year of healthy life. So if the country you live in has a life expectancy of 75 and someone dies at the age of 70, well, they've lost 5 theoretically healthy years of life. So that is 5 DALYs that person contributes to the statistics. What's interesting about this is it takes into account not only death, but when death occurs. It also takes into account the number of years that someone lives with disability. So if someone lives with a disease that causes a lot of disability, that is also taken into account. It also takes into account different age groups, and it gives different weight to when different people die. So if we have a country where 75 is the expected number of years to live, and someone dies when they're 5, they've lost 70 DALYs. They die when they're 70, they've only lost 5 DALYs. So it's a way of showing the burden of child mortality. The higher the number of DALYs means either more people are living with disease longer, or you have a higher infant mortality rate. So let's say we wanted to calculate the DALYs for one person with diabetes. So this person dies at age 60, and they live in a country that has an expected age of 75. So do the math, and they have lost 15 potential years of life. But before they died, they were about 50% disabled due to the kidney and foot problems associated with diabetes. And they had this disability for 10 years. So 50% disabled over 10 years, they lost 5 DALYs. So this individual lost 20 total years of healthy potential life due to diabetes. And if this person died at a younger age or lived with the disease for a lot longer, this DALY indicator would go up. So the higher the number, basically the bigger the burden of disease in this community. DALYs are used most often to assess the global burden of disease. The global burden of disease study is the largest and most detailed global health study that has ever been conducted. And the goal is to quantify trends in human health. We want to basically understand what diseases are kind of weighing down on different communities and how is that changing over time. The global burden of disease study allows us to make comparisons by diseases, injuries, different risk factors across all of these different categories. Again, we are searching for patterns, we are searching for trends, and this is a useful tool for that. Let's look at an example. So this is the DALI estimates for air pollution. So remember, the higher the number, the more years of healthy life that are lost, either due to death or living with the disease. And so we can see that air pollution is taking more healthy life away from parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We see Russia, other countries in kind of Eastern Europe. The US is a little lower, but this gives us an idea of basically where air pollution is placing the most burden on society. So if we wanted to design an intervention, we're working for the World Health Organization, and we wanted to try to reduce the disease burden from air pollution, this is a nice number for directing us to certain areas. We can also use this to compare different diseases over time to see how the burden of disease has shifted over time. So if you take the DALIs from a bunch of different types of diseases and you rank them based on high to low DALI, because remember, high DALIs means more disease and death. Diarrheal diseases, cardiovascular, and neonatal disorders contributed the most DALIs in 1990. Fast forward to 2016, and you can see where changes have occurred. Some of these factors have not really changed. Some have gone up, some have gone down. This gives us a sense of shifting kind of health of the global community. And you can play around with this data in this link. I would recommend it. It's a really cool website, and they rely quite heavily on this DALI. So just to kind of show what this thing can do, here is the DALIs due to animal contact, which I think is fairly specific. But you can see that India contributes the most DALIs from injury and death due to animal contact. So I'm assuming they include snake bites and things like that. This is a map of leukemia, DALIs. And you can see where in the world leukemia has the biggest impact. If you want to watch, and I recommend this video, it's a short one, how these kind of indicators can be used to really tell stories and look for patterns in the health of populations. So let's shift a little bit to understanding how we might use this stuff in our own calculations or for doing epidemiology ourselves. This is a data set looking at West Nile virus in 2021, this year, for each county in California. So you can see the first variable or the first column is broken up by different counties. We also have the number of diagnosed West Nile virus cases that go with each county. So Butte County has 9 cases of West Nile virus so far in 2021, and you can go down the line. We also have information on the number of people who have died from West Nile virus in each county. And I'm interested in understanding mortality rate per county. So I know the calculation that I need to make. Let's see if I can do this. Deaths per population. So I want to calculate the mortality rate of West Nile virus per county, because I want to see where the risk of dying from West Nile virus is higher. Now remember, we can't just compare the number of cases, because as you can see, there are counties with a lot of people, Los Angeles, and there are counties with way fewer people. So if we just compared the number of cases, that would not give us an accurate estimate. So we want to control for that by dividing the number of cases or the number of deaths, depending on which calculation we want to look at, by the size of the population. So where did I get this data? Well, the California Department of Public Health released estimates of number of cases and the deaths from this disease. And I know that I need the population size to complete some of my equations. So this type of information can be found from the US Census, which goes around and tries to estimate how big different parts of the United States are. So I can look up, let's say, Marin. And we can see the estimate around 258,000. So again, these are just estimates. There's no way to know with 100% certainty how many people exactly live in Marin County and how that changes over time. So let's just use an estimate that the US Census gives us, so 258,000, and we can do this for each county. So I went ahead and put this information into this sheet to show you how we can use this information to start putting together a data set. And let's look at mortality rate and incidence rate. So let's start with incidence rate. 2021. So I know that my calculation is the number of cases divided by the size of the population. So let's add that equation here. You can put the equal sign, and this can be done in Google Sheets. It can be done in Excel. And this is a pretty easy way of using this formula to find this data point. So I want to know the number of cases divided by, and I'll click the population. And I include this, this calculation within these brackets. So press enter. It may or may not give you like an autofill option. Let's say I want to reject this for a moment. So this tells me that the incidence rate in Alameda County is 0, which makes sense because there were 0 cases. Now, you could, if you wanted to, go down and type a new equation for every, but I would recommend is start with that first cell. You can see a little square show up in the bottom right if you hover over it. Click on that, hold it, and drag it down. Google Sheets or Excel will automatically calculate the incidence rate for each county. Pretty cool. So this is technically the incidence rate of West Nile virus for Butte County. Now remember, I can multiply this by 100,000 to get a nicer, rounder number. So let's do that. I want to calculate incidence per 100,000. So it's just a matter of creating an equation, equals, and then a parenthesis. And I want to calculate the incidence divided by 100,000. Do it for every county. And now these are a little more friendly to work with. So in Butte County, instead of saying 0.000004, we can say the incidence rate of West Nile virus in Butte County is 4.1 per 100,000 people. And you can compare where is the risk of contracting West Nile virus higher? Which counties? Do the same thing for mortality. If we want to understand the mortality rate, similar approach. Start with an equation. Equals, and this time instead of number of cases, number of deaths is my numerator, divided by the size of the population. This gives me my mortality rate. Now again, I can turn this into a little bit of a friendlier number. Equals. Okay. So Butte County, for example, has an incidence rate of 4.1 per 100,000 and a mortality rate of 0.456 per 100,000. And because we've included population in the equation, we can compare these numbers across counties. Even though each county has a different size population, as you can see here, LA has way more people than Lake County. If we use incidence rate or mortality rate, we can make that fair comparison. We can also do things like adding up the total number of cases across the entire state, because what if we wanted to know like the incidence rate and mortality rate of California overall? I'm going to make a new row down here, just call it California. And I'm going to start a new equation, equals. And I want to do all of the cases added up together. That command is sum, S-U-M. I'm going to tell it what I want added up. So I'm going to start with this county and go up. And I'm going to finish and close the bracket. And see, click enter. 31 cases of West Nile virus in 2021. I can do the same thing for the number of deaths. population. And I can calculate the incidence rate and mortality rate for the entire state using the same approach as we've done before. So equals, let's do 31 total cases divided by total population of California. So there's our incidence rate for West Nile virus for the state. Let's turn this into a more friendly number. So we want to do this number is 100,000. There we go. Pretty low overall. And again, you can do the same thing for mortality. This is an important skill that we'll use moving forward. It's how you can start to create data sets using epi data, and this will be helpful for this class exercise. So this is it for the first part of this this talk. Enjoy, and I will see you all soon.